Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Am reading video for Friday, June 12th, 2020. Picking up where I left off last week, I finished this book, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, a novel by Dinaw Mengestu. This was one of the books that was part of last year's Uncensored DC Banned Book Scavenger Hunt that's put on annually by the DC Public Library. And this is the one that fit their theme the most, I think, about gentrification and what it's doing to urban neighborhoods, particularly DC urban neighborhoods, because this book takes place primarily in Logan Circle in DC. Our protagonist is an Ethiopian immigrant who moved to the neighborhood some 17 years ago when it was run down and the rents were cheap, but that has very much changed with gentrification efforts, with more wealthy people moving back in, and particularly in his neighborhood, it was once a place of power with mansions that people of importance lived in, and then it got run down. So it's now the place where people with money can go to refurbish those homes. But when they come and drive up the property value, the people who lived around that area who could not afford that sort of rent or anything are being kicked out. That's a backdrop of this story, really, which takes place with alternating chapters between the winter and the summer of, or spring of, a contemporary year, which I assume would be the the 2006-2007 era, because that's when this was published. The springtime story is about Mengestu's protagonist, Mr. Stephanos, who usually goes by Stephanos. He's losing his business. He is a small business owner. He owns a little market. It's not entirely even, I think, based off of gentrification, although it is true, and I guess it does really feed into his actions to a significant degree, that he's getting fewer customers and that the new people moving into the neighborhood just don't go to him for most of their needs. But another reason why his business is failing is because he's in a bit of a funk, and he's not even opening at regular hours anymore. So there's that as well, although I do think I should say that he did his part to try to keep up a little bit. He put in a deli, he tried to modernize, so obviously there are things here going beyond his control. But this is a character novel to an extent, and a lot of his personal internal conflict has to do with the winter story, which is when he befriends some of these new neighbors. This woman, Judith, who buys a dilapidated mansion and fixes it up and moves in with her biracial daughter, Naomi. And Stephanos and Judith kind of enjoys a somewhat lonely, sad little flirtation where it doesn't go anywhere because it seems like neither of them are able to put in the effort at the same time. Although his relationship with Naomi, as long as it lasts, it's rather sweet. During her school breaks, Naomi would come to the store and they would read literature together. There's a eulogy feel to this piece. I think that's more prescient than any of the character beats. And it comes from the changing neighborhood. It also comes from the fact that Stephanos is a refugee by all, in spirit, if not technicality, because he fled Ethiopia some 17 years ago after his father was murdered by revolutionaries. And one of the things they were even going after was some pamphlets that Stephanos, the young Stephanos, was handing out. So his life could be in danger, and he moved in with an uncle in Silver Spring, which is where I live and has a pretty significant Ethiopian population here. But Stephanos kind of wanted to be his own man and move beyond his community and see new things, and so he moved to Logan Circle and opened his business, and granted, his two closest friends are other African immigrants from different countries, and I thought that character relationship stuff was the strongest in terms of relationships in the book. where they talk about who they are and what they want, and they go on very differing paths within the American DC area experience, so it was really interesting to go into that. I thought Judith and Naomi were more disappointing. They weren't really fleshed out, and their story wasn't really fleshed out. They were sort of just a catalyst, I guess, for things to react against, like Stephanos trying to make a life for himself with, companionship and literature, and then, of course, the neighborhood reacting against gentrification. So I think, in a way, that's why I stepped back a little from the novel, because it really isn't very strong in character beats, but that feeling of longing and of changes in your neighborhood and your community that are beyond your control, and you're trying to go after your dreams, that was a lot of a stronger piece thematically. And in a weird, biased way that really should have little to do with this book, I'm also emotionally feeling this sort of eulogy, to probably be too dramatic, about DC, because I haven't been in DC since the coronavirus really started. I live in the Maryland suburbs, but close enough that I can see the Capitol Dome from my balcony, and I have a lot of life that went on in DC, so I'm also feeling that sense of longing for rather different reasons. But I can see why this book is really liked. I mean, it won some awards. Because of these themes, and that it does get universal, not coronavirus, but there are those universal themes of striving for something and of changes beyond your control, and it gives you a lot to chew on, and so I really liked it. Next, I took a hard left turn into Educated by Tara Westover. I'm only saying it's a hard left turn because I didn't mention this book at all last week, and now I've finished it. It came to me on audio from the library, and I wanted to get around to reading it. This was a very hyped up memoir from a couple years ago, but the reason I specifically am reading it in the here and now is because I'm slowly going through the Reading Women Awards from the podcast started by booktuber Kendra Winchester and her friend Autumn. And I think Educated was the nonfiction winner for 2018. That's where I am. This is a memoir that is maybe more simple than I'm thinking of it right now in my mind. I mean, it's about a woman who basically comes to challenge the fundamentalist, extremist view she grew up with and takes a different path. It happens a lot. I read a lot of ex-Hasidic memoirs, after all. Although these people, I don't know, I think they make the Hasidim look a bit more like everyone else. Westover was raised by extremist Mormon survivalist parents in the hills of Idaho, rural Idaho. They are Mormons, although I think they take it the extra mile. They're a lot more literalist about the things they preach, it seems. Or maybe I'm being too harsh on Mormon doctrine, but in terms of Westover's family, they don't believe in, any state-run education or the modern medical establishment or anything like that. They want to be completely self-sufficient, except, of course, that God is, the ruler of us all. Her father owned a junkyard, and her mother dealt with herbal medicine and that sort of thing. In fact, now it seems like she has a pretty booming business out of it. Westover and her family were constantly getting into huge scrapes, as it were. That's a weird way to put it, but they'd basically have horrible accidents at the junkyard or at their odd jobs, and because they don't believe in hospitals, they'd use this natural medicine to try to heal themselves as best they could. But the main falling out, I think, that Westover had with her father ultimately comes down to the idea of truth, and that as Westover slowly got more involved in the secular world, or at least the academic world, she was drawn to the idea, as she learned more about the world that she had no idea about, that there could be different sorts of truths, and that she wanted to be able to look at them all. And I think at first it started out as but my father can still be true in some way, and then it sort of morphed into, but I don't want to live under his thumb and only accept what he says. I want to be able to make up my own mind. I feel like that's a major impetus of what she was going on. But a more immediate pressure point had to do with some abuse that she suffered for years at the hand of an older brother. A lot of physical abuse, but also psychological from him and also her parents. I mean, the psychological starting from, you know, I'm doing this to you because you're acting like a child or you're behaving like a slut, all the way up to it didn't really happen the way you say it did, or, you know, he's not as dangerous as you say. And that's something she ultimately couldn't comport herself into anymore. She, you know, created a narrative where she denied what was happening because her whole family was denying it, but she ultimately couldn't do that anymore when she was elsewhere in her life, so removed from this. And it's more complicated than that too, I think, because some of her family members would corroborate with her about this abuse, and those of them who were then dependent on the family for their income would usually backslide because, you know, if they were to stand up against the parents and the brother, you know, they'd be cut off. And those of her siblings who were able to move out of the family realm actually stuck with her. So, yeah, I mean, I just thought it was a powerful story. She's a really good writer. I guess I have, again, just inserting myself, I have a lot of feelings too about the idea of education and the humanities and trying to form critical thinking skills and wondering what my relationship is to literature, all that sort of stuff. It also bears noting, although Westover doesn't go into it herself, how rare it is. She was someone who was barely homeschooled, someone who didn't know what the Holocaust was or that Europe was a continent, not a country, and she was able to go to a prestigious PhD program in England. And, you know, that sort of stuff happens with, I think, a fair degree of nepotism within academia circles, within these relationships that you build up with advisors, and also aptitude at testing to get your foot in the door when you don't even have a high school education. Not to say she didn't also work hard, but, you know, but I think it's still worth mentioning because I think of other people who also barely had any education and weren't able to advance as far. But anyway, I think this one was worth the hype and worth the award, and I'm grateful I finally got the chance to read it, or listen to it. And from there I finally started Passage West by Rishi Reddi. Just holding up my picture from last week. It finally came to me from the library through ebook, and I'm just sitting down to read it. I'm only a couple of chapters in so far. I was wrong on a few things that I was assuming last week, and actually while I'm at that I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think with this book, with the Dinaw Mengestu book, I said I thought it might be autobiographical, but that doesn't seem to be fair at all. It's just that he and his character are both Ethiopian immigrants, but other than that I think their stories are quite different. Mengestu came as a very young child and his character was a late teenager. But anyway, back to Passage West. I said something about the family coming in the 30s as immigrants, which I think was a previous book I read was about a family coming to America in the 30s as immigrants. This family, or these Indians, come to America in about 1912, 1913. So this is a historical novel. It's I've only read 2 chapters. It's doing a lot of jumping. It starts in 1972 when I think the 2 main characters, these 2 older men, are older men in 1972, and one of them seems to be near his deathbed. And from then we skip to chapter 2, which is a bunch of letters written in, I think, 1913 and 1914, between the 2 of them as they're setting themselves up in America. So that's where I am. It's very early stages. Another thing about the ebook is that there's a very long cast of characters in the beginning, which I think might be Reddi's way of compensating for the fact that she has a lot of names that are unusual for Western readers and a lot of culture that might be unusual for Western readers. But for me, I think it was too much of an overwhelm, and I decided I'm just going to try to keep up with people's names as we go through the story. I do a lot of reading, after all, and I think that I have a handle, at least on remembering the most important characters. I guess we'll see. I'll be back next week to tell you what I think. And finally, next on the docket is Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. This is one of the books that is near the top of my Goodreads TBR, meaning it's been on the list for a couple of years. And I was going to read it next month, but my mother and my aunt decided they wanted to do a book club with me about this book, so now I'm reading it now. And I will read from the back. Called A Magnificently Crafted Story, Brimming with Wisdom by Howard Frank Mosher in the Washington Post Book World, Crossing to Safety has, since its first publication in 1987, established itself as one of the greatest and most cherished American novels of the 20th century. Tracing the lives, loves, and aspirations of two couples who moved between Vermont and Wisconsin, it is a work of quiet majesty, deep compassion, and powerful insight into the alchemy of friendship and marriage. And this copy also has a foreword and an afterword. The foreword by Terry Tempest Williams and the afterword by T.H. Watkins. So yeah, I think this is pretty close to my usual wheelhouse. I love family drama, but I can deal with friendship/couple drama too. And I seem to be staying in the western part of America for now, maybe more rural than I'm usually used to. I wonder if any thoughts on Educated will seep into my thoughts about this book. And Passage West, I should say, also takes place a lot in California, so we're in the west. So. Oh, I can't do any real traveling westward during coronavirus, so I'm stuck here on the East Coast, and maybe this is my way of spreading my wings a bit while I'm in quarantine. So that about covers it for me now. As we inch closer to the middle of June than seems possible, it is certainly summer now, even if not officially. The weather in the DC area is ratcheting up most days to 80 to 90 degrees. At the moment I don't have my AC on, but I often open my balcony door, which Missy, my cat, and I seem to enjoy a lot. I don't usually like thunderstorms, especially the thunder part as they're happening. Me and dogs have that in common. But I like their effect when they cool down the weather a little bit. I'll just live in the afterwards. So, I hope to be back sometime midweek with an author's answer video. Doing it a little earlier than usual in the month because at the end of June I will be doing my quarterly wrap-up for all of my writing goals. So. Speaking of that, maybe I should go now and get to some writing. And also, of course, back to Passage West. Hope you all have pleasant weather this weekend at least, even if we're not completely back to normal yet in the world. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.